Hello again. This week we are looking at data visualization, which in this context we're talking about doing some basic graphs and charts in Excel. But first we're going to talk about why we would visualize and get a bit of background of how we might use it, what is good and what is not good, because you do need to keep this in mind. In your research reports you will need to provide some appropriate visualizations that help your argument. So talking about visualization, there are kind of two aspects of why we would want to visualize. One is exploration and the other is explanation. So you can use it very effectively to get to know your data, and this is not necessarily things that will appear in your final report, but it just helps you to explore what you have very quickly. It can also help you to formulate hypotheses because you can visually see trends in graphs and charts that you can't necessarily identify when you're just looking at like tables of numbers. And in terms of explanation, that's conveying to your audience what you found. So telling us about your findings, helping us to understand the world differently by how we look at it, or helping us to make sense of data more quickly. The times that you want to use graphs and charts in reports are times when a picture is worth 1,000 words, essentially, that it conveys more information than you would be able to otherwise. So why visualize? There's lots of advantages to it, but in terms of disadvantages, you do need to think about the fact that you lose some amount of precision because most of the time you can't put labels on everything, so you can't convey the same amount of information as you would in a table. If you don't do it well, it can be misleading or wrong. And another major problem is if you look at a data visualization and you think there's a pattern where there isn't really, because the human eye wants to see patterns, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they actually exist. In terms of making sense of data, as an example, a pie chart gives us a really good idea of proportions. So if we look at this pie chart of voting intention, we can see the clear split between the Conservatives and Labour. We can see what proportion Lib Dems and UKIP received. It can also help us to convey the information quickly. So as I said, sometimes tables can actually be more confusing than helpful. This is the same information as the table conveyed in a chart instead. And here we can see it's a lot easier to pick out the trend than it was in the previous slide. I also mentioned that it's helpful for detecting patterns. This is a famous example because it has 4 sets of value pairings which look like absolutely nothing when you stare at them in a table. But when you turn them into charts, suddenly you see that there are some very clear patterns going on. But we do have to be careful because data visualization can distort things. Some particularly common problems are putting too much information in, making it really hard to read, not having coded your data appropriately, thinking about the effects of using counts versus percentages. And we're going to look at some examples of these different ways that you can go wrong in just a moment. But I also mentioned data visualization and contextualization. So contextualization is thinking about proportions, for example. Is this a big number compared to its context? It sounds like a lot of money when we say £100 million were spent on X. But is it £100 million in the context of a £500 billion economy? Or is it £100 million in the context of £150 million annual budget? Those are some big differences. We also always need to think whether there are other factors that need to be taken into account, whether we're actually showing a case that's unusual or representative of a general pattern, and whether the time period that we've picked is appropriate. So we need to think about two different aspects when we're doing data visualization. We need to think about what type of chart that we use, and we also need to think about how we format the number. Is it just a raw number? Is it per capita? Is it GDP? Is it purchasing power parity? And we need to keep all of that in mind. So looking at a few types quickly. Pie charts used with categorical data. So that means that the name of the category, it simply represents a category. It's not a quantifiable, measurable number like age or height or length. You always show the data as a proportion of 100%. You need to use it with very few categories, and I would say it's probably one of the most abused forms of data visualization. You do have to be careful about colors. There are a few times, however, when it can be very useful to portray proportions. So a few examples from genuine publications of how you can go wrong with this. Basic maths. A pie chart has to add up to 100%. You cannot make a pie chart in which the pie wedges don't add up to 100% or very close thereto, where the difference is only from rounding. Too much information. Data visualizations are supposed to help us understand it more quickly, not to slow us down so much that we have to think very hard about what we're looking at. The ironic thing about this particular example is that note at the bottom. Figures for 1980 and 1990 are not shown for the sake of clarity. Too many categories. This is another government report. DEFRA provide a wealth of examples of how not to use pie charts. This is incredibly confusing. When you have wedges as narrow as, for example, Turkey and Vietnam, the only point that we can take from this is that the UK consumes about half of its food from domestic production and the other half is imported. But that's not a good pie chart. And finally, colors. If you have any issues whatsoever with your vision, then this is an incredibly hard chart to read. We're supposed to be able to see the different wedges of the pie, but the colors are so close to each other that it is really difficult. Okay, on to the second type, bar charts. You can use these with any kind of variable, so you can use them with categorical variables like marital status. You could also use it with continuous variables like age. And the major failure that tends to occur with bar charts is making sure that your axes are scaled properly. And we'll see what that means in just a moment. So taking a genuine UKIP election leaflet, this was taken from the electionleaflets.org website, and if you just look for a second what the difference in the gap between Conservatives and UKIP, and then UKIP and Labour looks like. So there was supposed to be an 11% gap between the Conservatives and UKIP, and a 1% gap between UKIP and Labour, but those gaps look the same size. Now if you're making it in Excel, it's not actually possible to make it look like that. Looking again at axis scaling, occasionally we do need to cut the scale off, but in general your scale should start at 0, because if it starts anywhere else, it can make something look like a trend that actually is not that big a difference. Then we need to think about the differences in what information is conveyed by what type of numbers we use. So if we look at this chart, this is showing the number of asylum applications received in each of the 27 EU member states between 2008 and 2011. And what we can see is that the UK comes up 6th in terms of total number of applications received during this period, and France and Germany ranked as 1st and 2nd, which would seem to support the idea that these 3 countries do take a lot of asylum seekers. However, they are also 3 of the most populous countries in the EU. So what happens if we look at the number of asylum applications as a proportion of the population in that country, which is probably a better measure of impact on that country? Well, this is what happens. The UK actually only ranked barely above Hungary during that period, keeping in mind, of course, that this is before the Arab Spring kicked off, and this is before the Syrian refugee crisis. Instead, Malta takes precedence as the top recipient, followed by Cyprus and then Sweden. We can also contextualize it in terms of ability to pay for refugees, because of course having refugees means that you need to provide basic assistance, some housing, access to food, and so on. Well, Pakistan consistently has the highest number of refugees per $1 of their economy to deal with it. And that's not dealing with internally displaced people, so people who've had to move because of environmental disruptions or other reasons like that. So our picture looks very different here. If you want to find the UK, it's usually down around 30th in the world once you start to contextualize it. So, looking at a couple of other varieties of bar charts that are the more complex varieties, you have stacked bar charts and you have clustered bar charts. And after we look at these, we'll look at line graphs and then we'll see how to do it in Excel. So, this is a combination of poor colors and way too much information stuck in a single chart. Really difficult to read this. But this is a stacked bar chart. Now, stacked bar charts are kind of like pie charts in that every bar contains the proportion. So you can do a stacked bar chart where it adds up to 100. It can be easier to convey different categories and relative values. For example, this survey question comes from the Transatlantic Trends database. And people are asked, next time you vote, do you think candidate parties' agendas on immigration will influence your vote? And what we can see here is the yeses and the nos, and this type of chart makes it easy for us to compare all of that very quickly, because we can look at the 2 shades of blue at the bottom of every bar to get a very quick idea of the proportion of people who said yes. Whereas this is a clustered bar chart, which allows us to compare 2 very different trends to each other within the same country. So this is the size of the immigrant population along with the perception of issue importance. So the yellow bars are the proportion of the resident population who had a foreign nationality, and the blue bars are the proportion of people in that country who rated immigration in their top 2 most important issues for their country in the Eurobarometer survey. And the figures for these two are from as close a time period as possible. What we can see here is we're basically looking visually for a correlation, and what we find is there isn't one. And if you ran a statistical correlation, you would find the size of the immigrant population is not tied to the perception of issue importance. There are a lot of other explanatory factors you would have to look for to address sources of xenophobia. Okay, turning quickly to line graphs. These should only be used with continuous variables and would normally be used to show trends over time. You can have lots of issues with axis scaling again, so what happens when you don't start your axis at 0? So this axis runs from 1,940 cows to 2,000 cows. And guess what? It came from DEFRA again. And this is what really happened to the dairy count numbers during the period in question. But they can be very useful to convey trends over time, and they can be useful to put 2 different trends on the same chart so that we can convey information. So this contains the same information as this, but this slide is contextualized so that the bottom line is as a share of gross domestic product and the top line is as a share of federal government spending in general. Okay, we are going to stop there for this week in terms of background information, and now you finally get to actually do something. We're ready now to learn how to create a couple of charts, and we're going to test some of the hypotheses put forward in this week's reading about xenophobia in Iraq. For example, at one point they say that economic scarcity is an important source of existential insecurity. So low levels of economic development tend to be linked with xenophobia and rejection of outsiders. What we're going to look for then is that the less developed countries in our dataset will have higher levels of xenophobia than the more developed countries. And the way that I'm going to divide this up is just between Arab League countries and countries that are members of both the OECD and the EU. I don't just want OECD members because that includes countries like Chile and Mexico, who are middle income countries. So we are going to start out by inserting our pivot table again. You may already have one left from last week, and that's absolutely fine. I've inserted my pivot table. I'm going to put my countries into the rows again, just like we did last week. But this week I'm going to add another one that is a filter on membership. What this allows me to do is to toggle my labels. So for example, I can just switch to Arab League countries. In this case I want to select multiple because I want Arab League and I want those who are both OECD and EU. So I'll press OK, and this gives me the countries in our data set that fit both of those criteria. Now, how am I going to measure xenophobia? We'll start out with people that they would not like as neighbours. So we have people of a different race, and we'll put that in the values box. We want immigrants and foreign workers, people of a different religion, people who speak a different language. And we're also interested in this one. When jobs are scarce, employers should give priority to the people of this country over immigrants. Now, you'll notice this is not very helpful because it's just giving us 11111 all the way down. Not helpful at all. So instead what we want to do, we want to change the field settings on each of these. Now you can change them up here. You can change them down here. In some versions of Excel, you can also change them up here. So I'm going to do it the easy way up here, but if you go into field settings, you can choose sum or average. In this case, it doesn't matter which. If you choose average, down here in the grand total line, it's going to show you the average for all of these countries. If, on the other hand, you choose sum, it's going to add up all of these numbers. But the only thing in this case that it will affect is that grand total row. So pick whichever one you want. Change them over. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a laborious way of doing things, but Excel is not great at everything. And we also want to show our values as percentages. So in this case, we can simply highlight all of these. We can go back to our home tab and turn them into percents again. If you want to show a decimal place, just click the increase decimal. The final thing I want to do is to make my columns a bit thinner because they are currently miles wide so that I can barely see anything on my screen. So I select those columns. I'm just going to drag it over to there. I'm going to select this row and I'm going to wrap the text, which just means that it won't continue to get wider and wider. Instead, it will start to move onto multiple lines, and just visually I prefer to have it at the top of the cell, so I've changed that as well. Okay, so what have we got? We've got a big table that we can pick out some trends from, but it's not necessarily that easy to get this information quickly. So what we want to do is to turn this into a chart. We've got an option actually to do a pivot chart, and we're going to do a clustered column chart in this case. So we insert it, and then if you just hover so that you get the four-way arrows, let's drag it down a little bit just so we have more space to look at it, and then expand your chart area until it's a size that you feel like you can work with. Okay, so we've got our membership filter going here. We've got all of our different countries, and we can get some general trends, but you might notice there's an awful lot of information in our chart here. So we might want to reconsider what it's showing us. What happens if we change? What happens if we change so that we remove our membership filter here? So it's going to make it really ugly for a minute. And instead, let's put membership into the axis field, and let's take country out of here. So now we've got Arab League and we've got OECD and EU. So this is much easier to look at. It's gone ahead and averaged everything for us. Isn't that wonderful? And we can just look at them. So the leftmost pale blue is would not like to have people of a different race as neighbors. Now, remembering our hypothesis is that low levels of economic development are linked to xenophobia and rejection of outsiders. So we're expecting to find higher levels of hostility to people of other nationalities, races, religions, and so on in the Arab League countries compared to the OECD EU countries. And we can see very quickly that's precisely what we have going on here. We can either look at it like this, or what if we want to see them side by side? We can click switch row column, and then what it does is it takes our different questions and it puts them along the x-axis, and it puts membership over here in our legend. So in this case, it makes it even easier if that's how we want to look at things. So all we did there was to switch row and column, and you can just toggle back and forth, super easy, depending on what you're trying to convey with this information. So I would say that we've proved that hypothesis, that yes, economic scarcity is definitely linked with higher levels of xenophobia. Now, this is not making an assumption that one is causing the other in this case, because we're not controlling for all kinds of variables, but we can say with a fair degree of certainty that this pattern does hold up. So the next things that we can look for are to test the thesis that instability is associated with higher levels of xenophobia. We have a few different ways that we can measure instability. So we have questions that were asked directly about whether you feel that you are living in secure surroundings, whether you feel secure in your neighborhood. We have questions whether you're worried about terrorist attacks and civil wars, which all of these would seem to be relevant to testing whether that's associated with higher levels of xenophobia. So in this case, I would say let's just take a single one of our hostility to foreigners or people of different race or whatever, and use that to compare the different levels of insecurity. So I'm going to choose in this case the question about having immigrants or foreign workers as neighbours. To explain this security question, I've gone ahead and cleaned up my pivot table again. I've put my values and column labels back into the main pivot table list, so all I've got left now are Arab League and OECD and EU. What I want to look at are the questions about security. The first one is living in secure surroundings is important to avoid anything that might be dangerous. So this gives us a general idea of people's feeling of insecurity. Now when I move it into the values, it looks really messy. It's giving me 2,558%, which looks like a payday loan APR. So what I need to do is to go into those value field settings. Part of what's happening here is the number format, because this actually is a regular number. This one is measured on a 1 to 10 scale. So let's switch this over to number, press OK, and let's show average and press OK. There we go. That's a lot more what we were expecting. In fact, let's go ahead and have 2 decimal places. Here we go. Okay, so we then have a question about how often they feel secure in their neighborhood. So we have to scroll down till we find it, secure neighborhood. And let's find out how that one's measured. So whenever you're not sure, you just go back to the main sheet. Got confidence, democracy, religion, older people, secure neighborhood. Okay, so this is percentage agreement. So this one we do want to show up as percentage. And that means that we need to go into our field settings again, change it to average, and change the number format to percentage. There we go. Then we have two questions about how worried they are about terrorist attacks and worried about civil war. So again, let's find out how those were measured. So this is again a measurement of agreement. So we're looking for those to be percentages. Let's find worries, a war involving my country, a terrorist attack, and a civil war. And again, we need to change each of these, the value field settings, average, number format, percentage, and on to the next one. And the final one. It's a bit arbitrary how it decides to format things. Okay, there we go. So we can wrap our text again so that it doesn't take up quite so much space, and then we can make our columns narrower and shift our text to the top. Okay, so we look like we can see some patterns already, but let's go ahead and turn this into a pivot chart. Again, we'll do a clustered column. Click OK. And now we already established that Arab League countries show higher levels of xenophobia, but we're also expecting that they will show lower levels of security. So the way that these were measured, living in secure surroundings, is important. Interestingly, that was a higher level of agreement amongst OECD and EU respondents, but more people are worried about wars in our Arab League countries. Part of the problem we've got going on here is that the living in a secure neighborhood is measured on a 1 to 10 scale, and everything else is a percentage. So we actually want to move this onto the secondary axis. So we can format data series, and we want it to plot on a secondary axis. Here we go. So now this makes a bit more sense, that we've got the Arab League countries. If we're looking at the percentage here, we can see this is a massive difference between Arab League countries. Worry about a war involving their country, worry about terrorist attacks, worries about civil war, that we're talking about double the amount in each case who are worried about these things. So this would seem, again, to support our hypothesis. When you're doing your reports, you're also welcome to bring in other data to test these things. So for example, there is the Fragile States Index. So if I switch over normal view, we've got the Fragile States Index. I've chosen the 2014 one specifically because the data that we're looking at for the World Values Survey is 2010 to 2014 for data collection. But there is more recent Fragile States Index data. You can look at it over time, etc. So what if we look at our countries here, so Arab League and EU. So ignore our pivot chart again for a moment, and we'll switch the membership back into the filters and add country into the axis fields, just that we can get an idea of who we might want to look at individually. Okay, so Algeria, it's a reasonably high level of security. So worries about war, it's pretty high. Terrorist attacks, yeah. So let's take Algeria versus Germany, and let's see what comes up on the Fragile States Index. I'm just going to do a quick search for Algeria, which has a score of 78.8 on the Fragile States Index, compared to Germany, which has a score of 30.6. So in this case, lower is better. Germany is at about half of the world average, and Algeria is above the world average in terms of insecurity. So what does this mean? That means if we put back in the questions about having immigrants as neighbours, and again we have to go through all the formatting of turning it into an average and making it show as a percentage. There we go. And wrapping the text, narrowing the column. Okay, so now we can finally compare it. So we then look at Algeria. 28% would not like to have immigrants or foreign workers as neighbours. And actually, in this case, we've got Germany at 21.5%. So we would say yes, that upholds our expectation that hostility to immigrants will be lower in countries that have greater levels of security. So we would expect, if we combined the Fragile States Index with this data, that we would also find this. Okay, we're going to stop there. So you've had a basic introduction to chart making for this week, but I think I've given you enough information for